Is Vampire Survivors a video game? The idea of meaningful play has followed us as an undercurrent to this entire discussion, giving way to more and more questions. What does someone get out of playing games at all? How are values formed, and what drives engagement? What makes a game good enough to care about? These questions are far more nebulous than the other topics so far because they are matters of taste and preference. The very reason multiple genres of games exist is because not every game can appeal to what every person finds valuable. For many players who praised Vampire Survivors, there were plenty of those who found it to be a boring waste of time. For all of the hype around the game that led to it receiving more than 150,000 positive reviews on Steam, there were still almost 1,800 negative reviews, complaining about much of the same things that my friend pointed to as critiques of the game design in her review. Much of the 2022 Game of the Year discussion seems to dismiss Vampire Survivors as a contender for the same reasons. A lack of gameplay depth once you unlock everything, no extrinsic motivation to pursue different strategies, no extrinsic motivation to play different stages. Once you find your strategy, the game is exactly the same every single time. Just as it has a very low barrier to reaching that flow state for new players, Vampire Survivors also has a very low ceiling for players to exhaust what the game offers and move on to the boredom side of the Mihaly flow scale. Only players who intentionally seek out finding a winning strategy for all the different characters and maps, who purposefully seek what novelty the game has to offer, will be able to find that novelty as its own form of engagement. However, if we had started this conversation at preferences, if we had started this conversation at different strokes for different folks, then we would not have explored these other dimensions. My friend challenged me to look more deeply at concepts I took for granted as inherently good. She has helped me to more critically look at games not in isolation, but as a part of their social context, which is an inherent part of understanding art history and art criticism. Which is why I will be spending this video exposing what the engagement of Vampire Survivors is, where strategy emerges, and the role that risk and random chance have to those dynamics. That's right. Now, we are actually reviewing the game. The idle game design. The first aspect of the design that I want to address is the idle game mechanics the game employs. People do not control any of the combat, any of the offense. They only control the character's position as they run away. Position and play defense. That alone is actually quite a lot more gameplay than your average idle game, wherein the player does practically nothing but turn the program on and let a number go up. I, in fact, already have a video about the nature of idle games which you can go watch after this. To summarize that video, the idle game was essentially invented as a kind of rhetoric that backfired, an attempt to make a video game that was so obviously not a video game that people would draw a line in the sand. However, what resulted was that people purposefully created a game out of that non-game, because watching a number go up passively was engaging enough to encourage players to latch on. In other bullet hell genre games, players tend to hold down an attack button but spend the majority of their cognitive load narrowly avoiding projectiles, often by measures of pixels in some extremely high difficulty enthusiast games. Vampire Survivors adopts this sensibility but removes the need to hold down one button, essentially asking the player to survive, but also survive in such a way as to let the auto attack destroy as many of the bullets, the enemies, as possible. The roguelike design. The main aspect of Vampire Survivors that makes it a Roguelike is that a player starts with nothing at the beginning of each run, while procedural generation affects the exact location and spawn points of enemies, objects, and drops of certain items. Each stage has exactly the same pattern of enemies showing up in the same order and at the same time. Vampire Survivors is technically a roguelite, as players are able to purchase permanent improvements to characters and upgrades. The central factor in the roguelike aspect of the gameplay is in the creation of builds. Much like other roguelikes, for example The Binding of Isaac, upgrades both active and passive alike are rewarded randomly. In Vampire Survivors, you have a choice of starting characters which have both an active and passive ability that will slightly adjust how your run progresses. One character may have a minor improved drop rate for experience points, while another could cause all active abilities to increase their projectiles by 1. Because of the random chance, a player cannot actively decide what kind of builds they are going to get. Yet a large aspect of the appeal of roguelikes is that you benefit from increasing your knowledge and skill as a player, rather than as a matter of in-game statistics. Vampire Survivors features a wide array of abilities, and those abilities even unlock hidden synergies at higher levels. With greater knowledge of what is available in the system, players can adjust what build they want to aim toward on the fly, regardless of their luck. For example, those synergies are not random, but instead guaranteed, and thus manipulable as a matter of skill. Larger sprite or glowing sprite enemies will almost always drop a treasure chest once defeated. If a weapon is fully leveled while the player possesses the synergy's passive item, the chest is guaranteed to provide one of the possible synergies. By obtaining the passives and focusing on leveling the active weapons using your level ups, players can reach the much stronger synergy weapons earlier on. Now, as I wrote that before, but as I continued playing, I actually ran into quite a few instances in which having the synergy and fully upgraded items and a chest didn't result in obtaining the synergy. So what was appearing like a guarantee to me may actually be random chance, and I'm not exactly sure how that applies. So take that for what you will as to the quality of Vampire Survivors' strategy. If that does not appeal, one strategy that you can employ to manipulate the random chance is to fill out all of your active and passive abilities as soon as possible. But once all the slots are filled, only those upgrades will appear whenever they are obtained. Thus, you can risk having a lower level build for more streamlined upgrades later on. At this point of knowledge, Vampire Survivors becomes a deck building game. Of course, some players will find one optimized method that works, and the results of this will cause players to trend toward repeating exactly the same game experience multiple times. As Sid Meier once famously said, given the opportunity, players will optimize the fun out of a game. That does not, however, invalidate that the potential for that fun exists. In particular, the roguelike elements of the game use the core engagement of completion to encourage players specifically to use characters that do not inherently appeal to them or are suboptimal, in order to experience the repetitive nature of the gameplay in a new way. I experienced this when I realized that the second stage was far more enjoyable early on because enemies they mainly came from two directions rather than all sides, and I used this stage to discover weapon synergies and to practice my movement strategies for new characters that I was unfamiliar with. Even in light of these more passive ways of manipulating the game, there are also active strategies that players can learn to combat the presented challenge. Active gameplay. In the book Homo Ludens by Johann Huizinga, agonism is listed as one of the central characteristics, perhaps even the primary characteristic of play. The agonist characteristic is essentially the concept of movement or active doing. Now, Huizinga was writing in a time before the creation of video games. He was thinking of sports, of dance, of music and festivals when he imagined play. He likely wouldn't have counted the minuscule fine motor movements of playing a video game as agonist at all. Yet, gamers often gatekeep because of their perceived sense of simulated movement as well. For some people, shooters and action games are more of a game than strategy games like poker or JRPGs. Know that my willingness to see movement and participation of any kind of game count as agonist comes from not wanting to adopt a standard that would end up disqualifying all video games as games when compared to significantly more active play like sport and other physical culture. In this case, when I call something active gameplay, I am not measuring how active something is or feels. Rather, I am recognizing a difference between something that can be decided upon and manipulated by mechanics, by the player's decision and movements, versus something that cannot. Taking a quote from Core A Gaming's video, The Korean Backdash, after discussing how an innovation in how to interpret a rule of basketball invented the dribble, and how dribbling was almost banned by the official sport, they said, quote, how you are allowed to move defines the game you're playing, and the same goes for fighting games, end quote. This quote also remains true for any game that features any movement of any kind. To list a few examples of active strategies available in Vampire Survivors, players can 1. Charge headlong into screen-crossing mobs once they have the Garlic upgrade to maximize experience drops. 2. Players can kite enemies into a single spot and position the enemies where the character's attack will hit. 3. Players can leave food items to be picked up later and stay within that area when a new wave arrives. 4. Players can either focus attacks on the singular large enemies by inching away just out of reach for the big experience drops, or focus on the mobs for many smaller drops. 5. Players can use the time stop ray to create an opening for retreat when surrounded by the circular plant mob. There are quite a few active decisions that a player can make while playing the game. Is the development of these strategies strictly necessary to play, or even progress past the 30-minute mark? No, not really. The skill floor and the skill ceiling of Vampire Survivors is clearly low, and its focus is not on the active gameplay skills that a player can develop. They are, however, still an important part of the game. Moving and balancing to balance those offensive and defensive sensibilities is a part of the game. Exploration and discovery. The last critique of Vampire Survivors is that because the gameplay is so repetitive and simple, there is little reason for a person to keep playing the game once they have experienced a few good runs. And while I do agree with this from the perspective of moment-to-moment gameplay, I think that Vampire Survivors does quite a lot to motivate exploration and discovery. This is not to say that the levels are uniquely explorable environments, but more so that the game itself becomes the thing to explore. When you first discover that weapons evolve with certain other items, it creates a desire to see all of the weapon evolutions. Once the player has the ability to see secrets on the pause menu's map, those secrets begin unlocking other tools for gathering and tracking information about the game. As levels progress, levels start showing unique behaviors that through the environments that can be destroyed, or walls that the player may walk through, or levels may end in a way that is abnormal to the rest of the experience. Written descriptions that accompany achievements and unlockables become a guidepost for finding what to do when the player encounters something strange on a run or looks for something new to try. Vampire Survivors creates multiple layers of secrets, and how to identify unlocking those secrets becomes the game that surrounds the gameplay of any given run on a level. Exploring the game itself beyond distinct levels becomes the reason to play the game henceforth, delivering on novel discoveries and challenges that the opening experience of the game does not. Even though that inherent repetition is never overcome, players who find that repetitive gameplay valuable on its own are then treated to entirely new experiences. And that's basically it. That's the whole of what the game has to offer. Even as you play the different modes of the levels, they are expansions on these fairly simplistic and small features collected together. While I enjoyed my time with the version of the game I played, I neither found it remarkably great nor remarkably bad. Like often happens in hype culture, a game that is moderately good and inoffensive, that can provide a lot of engagement for a low financial cost, was elevated to a one-hit wonder of the season. I highly doubt that people will continue to talk about the cultural impact of Vampire Survivors in 2023 or 2024. It is worth giving it a try, and like with all things that one can find enjoyable and engaging, manage your time playing it responsibly. Please don't neglect your obligations for a video game. And for the love of God, be kind to people. Don't be cruel to people because of a video game. And stay true.